Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we will discuss this week's EU-US trade deal. Then we will turn to a conversation with Lykke Friis, director of think tank Europa, to discuss Denmark's presidency of the European Union. A few housekeeping notes, though, before we dive into the conversation. First, we will be going on a European-style summer hiatus in August. Actually, it's just a DC summer hiatus as well. But fret not, we have two excellent pre-recorded interviews ready for you to listen to while you lay on a beach or wherever you are. Or if you're less fortunate, while cursing at the humidity on your morning commute here in Washington or the rain in Brussels, we will return to our regularly scheduled programming in September, but we have two great episodes, but we won't have a news segment in part because it's August and there's not that much news. Second, we're going to try doing a mailbag episode with listener questions in September and would love to hear from you. If you have any questions about transatlantic affairs, Eurobonds, or my terrible pronunciation of European names, please send them to us at erep@csis.org. That's erep@csis.org. Details can be found in the episode description. We hope you enjoy the show. So then at the end, the big trade deal has occurred between the EU and the United States at Trump's golf course in Scotland, where EU officials made the long trip up to non-EU territory there in Scotland to come to an agreement. What's in this deal?
Well, here's what we know of what's in the deal. The big headline here is baseline tariff rate of 15%. That's not additive to the tariffs that we had before, after Liberation Day, all this stuff. It would be 15%. Then there's a lot of fine print to this. I mean, the good news is for cars, that would be 15%, whereas they're currently at 27.5%. For other things like pharmaceuticals, it would be potentially 15% depending on some investigation that is currently going on. It would be the same thing for aluminum and steel. There's currently a U.S. investigation into those tariffs. Then we'll see after that. So I think it's important to say, that's why I'm saying the headline is 15%. Some specific categories of goods might be different.
Right. There's other areas where they didn't come to an agreement.
Right. And there's investigations under the guise of national security, the 232 investigations. And then there's some parts that I think is good news, which is zero tariff agreements on aircraft and aircraft parts, some chemicals, semiconductor making equipment. Obviously, we talk about this all the time these days. Natural resources, critical raw materials. So that obviously is the biggest positive headline coming out of this, is the 0 for 0 tariff. There's two other important pieces to this agreement, and then we can talk about the fact that it seems the two sides seem to understand those things differently. One is the EU pledging to buy basically $750 billion worth of energy until the end of Donald Trump's term, which is 3.5 years from now. That's a lot. That would include oil, LNG, nuclear technology, things like that. And it could be a mix of purchases. And then the last bucket is there is an intention to invest $600 billion from European companies into the US, also over the course of Trump's second term. Unclear what that covers and how the Commission would direct private industry to direct those investments towards the EU. But those are the big numbers that are coming out of this. Here's the problem. After this landed, very quickly, we seem to get a vibe that both sides are interpreting this deal slightly differently. So, for example, on the $600 billion investment, the Commission says it's an intention, but the White House readout says basically they've pledged to invest this. On the energy side, there's big questions around demand and whether they can get that to $750 billion. And then there's some of the non-trade barriers that are up for discussion as well. The White House side says that there's been conversations around digital regulation. There's intent to discuss these things. The Commission says, absolutely not. We did not discuss this at all. Similar things for agriculture, around standards for agriculture, which of course we all remember the days of TTIP and the chlorinated chicken. This matters a lot to Europeans, is making sure that agriculture and, livestock regulation is very strict. And there's distrust when it comes to US products. Same thing, the White House seems to interpret this as we will talk about some of these barriers. The European side says, no way, we did not talk about this. So it's hard to tell, obviously, where this lands. There's a couple things, as we were discussing at first, that need to be figured out around pharmaceuticals, the aluminum and steel tariffs. Here as well, there's misunderstanding. The EU says no tariff until the results of the investigation. The White House says, no, it's 15% on all of these things right away and still investigation. So here's where we stand. So I think the takeaway for me is it's not entirely clear to me what the EU gained. Temporary reprieve is the most obvious thing, getting the temperature to cool down a little bit. But at the same time, no one seems particularly thrilled with this deal, from the Germans to definitely not the French, but even Friedrich Merz was like, it's not great for German industry. I don't think we could have got better, but it's not great.
Yeah, look, I would not read this deal literally. I think you have to interpret it figuratively. Yeah, I think the only thing that is literal is that European goods coming into the United States will now have a 15% tariff, and American goods going into Europe will not. And so it's not a reciprocal trade agreement. And, there's a lot of talk of like who won and who lost. Well, look, if I'm buying French champagne here, I'm paying the 15%. Suddenly, I'm losing. American consumers are now going to pay more for European goods. So I think who won, who lost is a little bizarre. Now, the major problem here for Europe is this round one? Is this sort of the beginning of what will be a series of fights? Or is this the end? Or is this, okay, you had a fight over trade, it was resolved, now you move on? I tend to very much be of the view that this is like not the end. This is the end of the beginning. And what I think that Europe demonstrated, not just with the fight over the tariffs, but also with the kind of bending the knee at NATO, trying to figure out a way to meet Trump's 5% demand, even if it's a lot of fuzzy math, is that the EU has looked really weak. And EU by EU and NATO has looked incredibly weak when Ruto is calling Trump his daddy. And what Trump sees from this is that Trump thinks that this is a big win. The US is getting all this revenue. EU is not. I think it's going to be bad for the US economy. But in Trump's mind, this is a big win. So what happens when all these upcoming fights, when, we have this place called Silicon Valley that has lots of really rich people that have given a lot of money to Donald Trump, that see the battle for global tech regulation taking place in Brussels, and now see an American president that is willing to use the security commitment as leverage and to really push the EU that looks like it's just weak and willing to bend on its principles and not willing to defend itself. So I just think that this is an appeasement strategy that is going to lead to more and more fights. Now, what I think is really interesting about this is the writing was on the wall here, right? Like, it was clear the EU was intent on caving because member states would not back von der Leyen and the Commission in taking strong action. They kept on talking about, don't make us wield the anti-coercion instrument. We have this tool, the anti-coercion instrument. And I think the Trump folks were like, well, why don't you use it? Why aren't you threatening it? It's like, well, we need to get approval first to then be able to threaten its use. And they're like, we're already in a trade fight. Like, why haven't you used it? And the EU just looked weak and feckless. But why didn't it use the anti-coercion instrument? Is that would require the member states. And what I find so mind-boggling about this is that von der Leyen is sort of forced to eat this. Like, the EU for a year has had to sell inside of the European Commission, thinking about how do you fight back against America on trade. And what had happened was the same member states, like the same leaders that are also at NATO bending the knee, are also the same leaders at the EU. So it's not like EU and NATO are actually different here. And the member states, especially Germany and France, were not really willing to back her in taking a strong response. And so all this rhetoric from Friedrich Merz back when he won about, we're going to really have to develop Europe. And then what we see is just total weakness. And then what I love is that, the French and the Germans being like, we don't really like this deal. It reminds me of that meme of the guy in the hot dog suit who crashes his hot dog car into the store. And he's trying to sort of say, who could have caused this? Who could have done this? Well, I mean, it's you guys that didn't create a strong European response. And it didn't require unanimity. Like, she didn't need unanimity, von der Leyen, to really fight for the EU. But you do need kind of Germany and France if you're going to get in a major fight. And ultimately, to me, this was about the security relationship that the United States provides. And EU leaders are trying to keep the US committed to NATO. They think they're making headway with Trump on Russia and Ukraine. I think Putin has more to do with that than they do. And their whole strategy is to try to engage him and try to soften down the edges. And I think that makes sense, except what does the U.S. agree to do? Have we agreed to not cut U.S. forces in our force posture review? We didn't even agree to spend 3.5%. So I think the European member states are incredibly weak and feckless here. And that is just sort of now going on the EU. And maybe one final point with them going on is that if there is a next fight and all the crap that von der Leyen and the EU is getting for not producing a better deal when they were, I don't think really could, I think the next time the EU is going to really punch back. And so I think this is teeing up for actually a bigger transatlantic fight down the road.
I think I agree with you. I 100% agree also on the optics of weakness. What is really confusing to me is there was this meeting with Merz and Macron recently, and it seemed like finally both of them were coming out of this with the French having convinced the Germans to go forward and punch back a little bit more on trade. Obviously, the French wanted some exceptions to this fight. They're like, well, don't touch our wine, please. The wine, please don't touch it. No tariff on the wine. But then nothing clearly came out of this because for sure von der Leyen talked to everyone before she went to Scotland. And this is what we get out of this? Like, I don't understand. There's immediate response to this, negative. You can decide for yourself, listener, if you think the French were hypocritical in this. But also there are people in the European Parliament who want to know, especially if von der Leyen made any commitments around regulation. Because yes, the Parliament doesn't have a say in the trade policy, but they have a say in the regulation and what passes. And for things they've already voted for, the Commission better not be making promises that they're going to walk back regulations that have been passed. These are laws. They have to be implemented.
I would say, I think if they've done that, that would have been in the U.S. readout. So I think they were pretty clear that they weren't going to do that. But I do think that that is teeing up sort of the next big fight will be on tech. I do think that if you take a step back, like this was sort of a fight between economists and between the kind of foreign policy geopolitical hands. The economists say the U.S. wants to put up tariffs, or whatever country is going to erect tariffs, don't retaliate because then you are just hurting your economy. You're just making your economy less competitive and goods more expensive. So don't do that. And this is actually deflationary probably for the EU. We're probably going to see continued separation where EU interest rates may continue to go their downward trend while the US, I don't know if they're going to go down or up, but they're pretty high. And so you could say, okay, this is fine. It's not great. But like if you retaliated and had a trade war, it could have made it a lot worse. The foreign policy hands are like, well, this is a mob shakedown. And if you let the bully steal your lunch money, well, then they're going to be back tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So it's sort of pick your poison here. The one thing I will say, I do think there's a longer term cost here for the EU. EU is very legalistic when it comes to trade. Everything has to be very WTO compliant. A lot of what they agree to, and I think a lot of it's figurative, not literal, but what they agree to in this deal may not be WTO compliant because it goes sector by sector. And I think it shows a lot of hypocrisy on the part of the EU because countries that deal with the EU as being the big giant and they're the kind of small minnow, and the EU is very legalistic. And here they're bending over backwards, making all these compromises. And I think that is going to have some long-term costs to kind of the EU's positioning itself as kind of the leader of a liberal free trading order, which is sort of where von der Leyen had been trying to position the EU with Mercosur deal, Indonesia, and others. And we'll see. Everyone around the world sort of understands that like we're just trying to like get out from under these.
I agree with that. I think the challenge is at some point you can't have it both ways. Either you want to really become a geopolitical commission and you use the tools you have to project power. That also includes in trade because you have a ton of power, a ton of economic power. Use it and show that you can actually project that power. Or stick to the law and then say no to stuff like this, to promising $600 billion of investments for 3.5 years in industries that we don't know what they are, and maybe defense procurements, but also no one can agree on whether that's true. And this also comes, I think, is a difficult spot for Brussels because it comes on the heels of a Nothing Burger summit with China as well. So are you projecting power in any kind of direction? It doesn't seem like that to me.
Maybe just to defend the EU on China, I actually think that they ended up taking a firmer line and didn't actually bend the knee to China as they did here. But maybe one final thought is that, look, these commitments, right, to buy 600 billion, whatever it is, in energy, I mean, the EU is reducing its fossil fuel consumption. And yes, maybe it's better to buy US LNG than Russian LNG, which it's still currently doing. That's great. Substitute. Perfect. But these numbers are ludicrous. And also, on the defense procurement, the EU agreeing to buy like hundreds of billions.
It goes against their stated goals.
Well, also, last I checked, the EU doesn't have money to buy hundreds of billions of dollars of defense. And, there's still actually the commission lawyers that say the EU can't buy weapons, which I think bunk, but that's still like on the books. So member states then are agreeing to do this? And they're not, right? Member states have been like, okay, we're shifting all our procurement plans to just buy all American. And it goes against, where the EU is headed on trying to build up its own European defense industrial base. That's why I think it's basically, I just take it as the EU plans to like keep buying US weapons and is going to keep buying US LNG.
And I think they'll try to see how long this deal can hold, to be honest.
And we'll see where we are in the fall when U.S. force posture review is announced and we're fighting over something else. Maybe they'll stiffen the European spine or maybe weaken it further. I don't know. But why don't we shift to our interview with Lykke Friis. We are thrilled to welcome Lykke Friis to the Eurofile. Lykke is the director of the Copenhagen-based think tank Europa, where her research focuses on Germany's role in Europe, Brexit, and the EU's global position. She's also a former Danish politician serving as Minister for Climate and Energy from 2009 to 2011, and Minister for Gender Equality from 2010 to 2011. Lykke, welcome to the show. Great to have you here to talk about the Danish presidency of the European Union.
Thanks for having me.
So on July 1st, Denmark began its 8th EU presidency since joining in 1973, and the slogan for the Danish presidency is, quote, a strong Europe in a changing world. The Danish presidency has said that it's going to work to secure Europe as well as competitive and green Europe. I'm curious, what is the priority for Denmark as it launches its 6-month presidency? And just for background, every 6 months, the presidency rotates between members of the European Union, and it's a real agenda-setting opportunity for European states. So what is Denmark's priority as we look ahead to the next 6 months?
Well, basically 4 priorities. Security, 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 and the ability to compete. I think that's the way that one can sum up the presidency. And what is actually new this time is that Denmark really wants to push these issues. We are very active, proactive with regards to European Union. Denmark used to be a very sort of skeptical country with regards to EU, had several referenda voting no, for instance, to the euro. Government always sort of very resistant, trying to see, okay, what's in it for us, not sort of coming forward with clear positions ourselves. And what has happened in Denmark is basically 3 things. I mean, first of all, Brexit. I mean, that completely changed sort of the way many Danes look upon the European Union. Suddenly, our big ally friend disappeared, voted no. And that also, because of the chaotic process around Brexit, led to a situation where Dexit, the ability to leave the European Union for Denmark, was completely, unrealistic. Then, obviously, Vladimir Putin, his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, completely led to a situation where Danes now realize that this is also about security, our own security. That was also one of the reasons why you actually had Denmark voting yes to the opt-out, getting rid of an opt-out with regards to defense. And finally, well, as you can imagine, and as our listeners can imagine, there is Donald Trump. So the relationship between Europe and the United States, that has also changed quite considerably, to put it mildly, after the change of government administration in the White House.
I want to ask you a little bit about Denmark's fiscal approach, because Denmark used to be, I'm curious, do you think it still is, a part of the so-called frugal countries that were opposed to increases in the EU budget, opposed to EU borrowing? But it seems like there's been a real shift. There's support, at least from the Danish government, I think, when it comes to issuing so-called Eurobonds for defense, and in a desire for the European budget, which has just been released, to increase collective EU spending on defense. So do you think there's been sort of a shift on the fiscal side, or is this sort of more of a rhetorical shift within Denmark? How is this resulting, I guess, in shifts in policy at the European level?
No, this is definitely part of our journey. I mean, from being at the fringes of the European Union to being at the core of European Union affairs. I mean, there are still areas that Denmark will not join. The euro is one of them. Maybe we can get back to that. But you now see this shift on. We are pivoting to Europe, I guess you could also say. And you've seen that with regards to the agreement on the opt-out, so getting rid of the opt-out, joining the EU's defense dimension. Denmark voted no to the Maastricht Treaty back in 1992. And we've always been very, very much in favor of NATO and our relationship to the US. So for us, it was almost dangerous to be part of a European defense dimension because it could undermine NATO. We didn't want to have the EU turning into a baby NATO, if you want to use that expression. So that is one change that you've seen. Second change is what you are exactly alluding to. That's the fiscal part of our membership. Okay, Denmark will not start the negotiations, also because we have the presidency, by saying, let's spend lots of money in the EU and let's really have a much bigger budget. Obviously, that will not be the approach. But yes, for the first time, Denmark has actually said we can accept. We are also open to the idea of having common lending sort of with regards to defense. But once you start talking about having more debt in the European Union, well, once it's defense, well, then you can also say it could be other areas. So this is actually a big change again in Danish EU policy. So we've gone again, from being sort of at the fringes to now almost a star pupil within the European Union, pushing for a number of issues. And what is perhaps even more importantly is that the public, the Danish sort of voters, they're on the same journey. They have almost overtaken the government, I would say, sort of being really, really pro the European Union. And that is definitely new.
And this is, I think, really coming out very clearly in Denmark's support for Ukraine. So as Denmark takes the helm now with its presidency of the European Union, it seems that it really wants to push forward on Ukraine EU membership. Denmark has been also doing a lot in terms of support for Ukraine militarily, the so-called Danish model where you invest in Ukraine's defense industry. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how Denmark is approaching Ukraine and how you see it fitting in the EU presidency.
Well, I think what happened immediately after Vladimir Putin had his full-scale invasion or started his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Danish citizens started to realize that the European Union is also a defense project, that this is a question of Denmark's defense. This is not just in quotation mark about Ukraine. Well, first he takes Ukraine, then he can move on, take the Baltics, and at the end of the day, it will also be Denmark. So again, a very strong support from the citizen side. Also, when you had the refugees coming, Danes very much sort of supportive of Ukrainians, and that is still the case. It is now even more the case because there is a feeling that, well, now we are in the phase of the war where things could either go terribly wrong or we could actually have a scenario where Ukraine can become a stable country after the war. So now we really have to make sure that we give the weapons that we have and also make sure that the rest of Europe follows suit. So here we are basically, you could say, the chief whip. This is the way we look upon ourselves in the discussion about donating weapons to Ukraine, although the Prime Minister said last week that we are not donating weapons, we are rearming ourselves. We're giving weapons or donating weapons, I'm using that expression again, to Ukraine. Secondly, what is important is that as the war has developed, the war is now perceived as a battle, a war between autocrats and democrats. This is an opinion poll that was made by European Council for Relations last month, which clearly indicates that you have 70% of the Danes arguing this is the case, whereas you look sort of rest of the EU, they're far lower when they answer this particular question. So I think that is again important, and this is something that also the government generally believes. We have a government where the ministers, they go to Ukraine, every week more or less part of the government. We just had the defense minister being there again, and all of them are accepted by or invited by the President Zelensky, and all of them get these sort of discussions, and that also proves how important Denmark has become. Also, as you mentioned earlier, the Danish model, which basically is that instead of sending weapons from Denmark to Ukraine, what we do is to send money to Ukraine, and then they can actually then develop the various weapons they need themselves. For the Danish presidency, I think although these sort of more defense-related issues are important, the most important one is enlargement, to make sure that enlargement negotiations actually start with Ukraine, to open the first cluster of chapters, as it's called. You have over 30 chapters, but then they are clustered around certain issues. And here the first one that could be opened is what is called fundamentals, where you have rule of law, anti-corruption legislation, and so forth. But there is a certain country called Hungary, so it is difficult because you have to have unanimity in order to open the first cluster.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the enlargement process, get a little bit more in the weeds in how this will work. Because, I think a lot of times Americans view enlargement as like, oh, just make the decision, let them in. It's sort of akin to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. But it's far more complicated when you're talking about joining the European Union, which is, in some ways a federal structure with tens of thousands of pages of laws and regulations. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you envision or how Denmark envisions the process with Ukraine kind of unfolding. And then maybe you could talk a little bit about how Denmark and how you see broader enlargement, because, there's many countries, especially in the Western Balkans, that have been doing this process for more than a decade, if not approaching two, and feel that this is just absolutely going nowhere. And yet, I think the French perspective, just to offer that for a second, is that their view is we can't really enlarge because we're already too big to really get anything done. Look at Hungary, as you just mentioned, blocking something. So we need reform before we can enlarge. And that, the two have oftentimes gone together. Treaty reform has oftentimes preceded enlargement. That's what happened before the Big Bang enlargement in 2004. So maybe if you could break down what does enlargement actually mean for Ukraine? What does Ukraine have to do? And then broaden it to what does it mean for kind of the broader Western Balkans, and how does the EU jumpstart enlargement?
Sure, many difficult questions there, but I'll try. I think, maybe one should start with sort of the comparison with NATO, because you're absolutely right. NATO enlargement, well, okay, they apply and well, that's it, then they're members. Except for the fact, obviously, that we had Erdogan in Turkey sort of vetoing for a long time the Swedish accession, but that had nothing to do with the overall negotiation process. That was politics. But in the EU, we are talking about a single market. So we are talking about standards for everything. When you buy chocolate or you buy sausages in one country, you should make sure that they all live up to the same standards. You have border control. When you accept the country, you should make sure that they actually sort of control the border in such a way that we don't get tons of migrants, sorry to put it that bluntly. And then it is also about agriculture. The various products that, can we sort of trust, again, going back to the sausage, that it is living up to the various veterinary standards? How much does it cost in regards to agriculture? This is a huge process, and that's why it takes quite a number of years to finalize negotiations. The way they're constructed, as I indicated earlier, everyone has to agree. So 27 countries have to agree on opening these clusters. So if only one country, and that is now Hungary, says, no, we don't want to open that cluster, then you're basically stuck. And that is what we're seeing now with regards to Ukraine. And that will be part of the Danish EU presidency. Part of the major role will be to see, can you somehow work around Hungary? Is that possible? And what reaction will you have there in Hungary, but also in other countries? Because, as you also rightly pointed out, Ukraine is not the only country negotiating. You also have the West Balkan countries. And yes, they have been in that waiting room almost for decades. At least a decade, some of them. So if you start sort of being very creative with regards to Ukraine, some of them will put up their hands and say, what about us? And that is already happening. That, for instance, Austria is saying, oh, hang on, if we cannot just do something for Ukraine, we should also make sure to push ahead with the West Balkan countries. If you look upon it right now, there is actually a chance that during Danish EU presidency, one will be able to start sort of writing the accession treaties for two countries because they're more or less done with the negotiations. That's Albania and that's Montenegro. So that will be actually two important decisions if that takes place. But once you have then negotiated, then you need to ratify. So that's why you have to go to all the member states and say, do you support this or not? The candidate countries, they may have to have a referendum. And once you get to that phase, that's where, for instance, France could say, well, we cannot really now sort of accept these countries before we have agreed upon a number of reform initiatives with regards to our institutions. So, well, you just have to wait another year. So these will be the core discussions that will not come during Danish EU presidency, but immediately afterwards, because once you get the negotiation going with the various candidate countries, you also have to answer that question at a certain stage. And going back to Denmark, we don't want to have treaty change because we have to have treaty change. Well, it takes time. And then maybe we also have to have a referendum. And then you also there see a bit of a shift. Because now, when you speak to Danes, they always ask me at the moment, so what about Hungary? What about Hungary? Well, I'm sorry. Hungary obviously has a veto right because it's unanimity. But we cannot have a situation like that. Then I always have to remind people, hang on. This about unanimity has always been something that we've been very much in favor of in Denmark. But now that's apparently also changing. So it's going to be a very important process for the EU. And at the moment, since Ukraine is not joining NATO, at least I cannot see that in my crystal ball, then, it will be so important for Ukraine if they can at least move ahead in the enlargement process.
Yeah, I think the Hungarian elections next year, I think everyone will be watching very closely. I know it's not looking too good for Orban, and I wonder if that election goes one way, that you could see an effort to really supercharge the enlargement and treaty reform discussion in 2026. We shall see. But I want to sort of shift gears. I think the big topic in the news, at least here in Washington, when it comes to Denmark, has been Greenland. The UK actually isn't the first one to leave the EU. Greenland, I think, was first.
Correct.
Formerly part of the European Union, then followed by Algeria after Algeria broke away from France. But the U.S. expressing designs, so to speak, on Greenland, Donald Trump saying he wants Greenland to become a 51st state, J.D. Vance traveling to Greenland. We have seen before the G7 summit, Emmanuel Macron stopped in Greenland. Is Greenland going to be part of the Danish presidency? And how is Denmark seeing this right now, this issue brought up by the United States? How is this impacting U.S.-Danish relations and how Denmark sort of sees Europe?
Well, again, I mean, that is a sea change. It is a major shock to Danish citizens that suddenly Donald Trump, also in the second period, started to talk about that he wants to have Greenland. Because, I mean, the first sort of Trump at 1.0, there was a feeling that, well, that's just something that he said, right? I mean, he said, well, I want to buy Greenland. And then the Danish prime minister answered that Greenland is not for sale. And then he said, nasty woman or maybe nasty lady. And then he canceled his trip to Denmark and texted the queen and said, I'm not coming. But then people thought that was it. And then suddenly you have immediately the statements coming from him about Greenland. And for Denmark, always having been such a pro-Atlantis countries, I mean, really sort of also fighting for the US in various wars, Iraq, Afghanistan. So people could simply not get their head around what was going on. And you can see from the various opinion polls also, I mean, the ones I referred to earlier from the European Council of Foreign Relations, that Denmark, you have some very stark figures there. I mean, when you ask Danes about how do they look upon Donald Trump, I mean, then 76% answer that he's bad for America, and then 78% believe that he's bad for Denmark. You also have 41% of Danes now answering that United States is a threat against Denmark. And you have 92% arguing that all the Nordic countries, they need to rely more on the European Union than on the US for its security. So there's a Greenland effect, you could call it here. And every day, Danish ministers get out of bed. I mean, that's what they think about. I mean, has anything happened with regards to Greenland? Any new statements coming out from Donald Trump? And yes, okay, that's not happening at the moment. There is sort of a sigh of relief, but there's still this feeling that this issue has not gone away. That is definitely the realization. It is still also a guessing game, and that's what is really worrying for people, because what is at issue here? Why is it actually so important for Donald Trump to keep on talking about Greenland? Are we talking about economics, raw materials, or is it territory? I mean, these are three very different categories for Denmark. That being said, I don't think this will play a major role during the Danish EU presidency, because Denmark at the moment has a strategy, you can coin it as follows: lay low and let the others do the hard work for you. Let's not talk about Greenland. You just had a number of ministers, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense coming to Washington. And there the core discussion was Ukraine and also NATO, not Greenland. And then you had President Macron going to Greenland, clearly sending the message that Greenland is not only Danish, it is also European.
Yes, we were lucky enough to host the Danish Defense Minister and Foreign Minister. We'll put a link to that event in the show notes. Thank you for the plug. Let me shift gears to talk about migration. And this is obviously a huge topic throughout Europe. It's seemingly almost every country in Europe, it's become one of the major political topics, usually really seized on by the far right or the right. But in Denmark, it's a different story, where the center-left government has really taken a hard line on migration and in some ways neutralized the issue for the far right. But this is going to be a topic for Denmark's presidency of Europe. How is this going to play out at the European level? And maybe you could talk a little bit about Denmark's experience with migration.
Well, I mean, Denmark for a very long time was sort of the naughty sort of student or pupil in the club, or in the class rather. What Denmark did about strengthening its migration policy, about constantly talking about that one should process the applications of asylum seekers outside Denmark/Europe, but in countries like Wonder. I mean, sort of suggestions or policies where, for instance, the German government led by Angela Merkel, but also after that, Olaf Scholz said, I mean, this is completely unacceptable. Let's not go there. What we've seen now is actually for the last years that Denmark is becoming more European on many issues, as we already talked about defense, but also the fiscal policy. But on migration, the rest of Europe is becoming more Danish. So all these sort of policy initiatives that I just mentioned, they are now at the core of the discussions, almost mainstream, I guess one can say. You now have a coalition of 21 countries having signed a letter saying that we should have a tougher migration policy and we should indeed look into sort of a process where you could then have the asylum application processed outside the European Union. The last country signing that letter was Germany, so the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And once you could see that he was now also arguing for this, you could almost sense that the power of balance in the EU was changing. So I expect that during the Danish EU presidency, these issues Denmark will try to push on this overall matter. It's going to be difficult to agree upon something because it's a bit more of a long-drawn process, these negotiations in the EU. But I think what one should mention is that Denmark, as part of its presidency, also has the presidency of the European Political Community, EPC. There's another acronym for you there. What on earth is that? Well, that was an organization a forum set up a couple of years ago by France, Emmanuel Macron, because he wanted to have a forum for all the countries basically supporting Ukraine. Could also argue that he set it up because he wanted to have an alternative for some of these countries trying to get into the European Union, so going for the real thing. But now it's this huge summit that takes place twice a year. You have all of them flying into Copenhagen. So Erdogan, Zelensky, the president of Azerbaijan, so basically everybody, also all the candidate countries. It's kind of like an advanced workshop where you have sort of heads of state and government, a meeting that will be in the Bella Center where you usually have summits. That's where we had the COP15 climate negotiations. And they have 4 sort of tables, or 4 issues now: security, and then migration. And these are the issues that Denmark has now put on the agenda. So that sort of confirms the point that maybe it's not so much decisions, but it is more sort of pushing the debate, making sure that one has sort of agreement that this is the way forward for the EU as such in the coming years.
I want to ask you about climate. Denmark has been a real climate leader. You, of course, worked on climate policy while in government. It seems that climate has sort of gone out of fashion, gone out of vogue over the last year. I think really since Donald Trump has won, there's been a backlash against, I think, the Green Deal. Do you think that EU climate policy is still on track? And is this going to be sort of part of what Denmark tries to push at the EU presidency?
It's very difficult at the moment because, yes, it has gone out of fashion. People rarely speak about climate policy anymore. You speak about security. You speak about the EU's ability to compete. That's the way you try to approach this debate. Or energy security is also part of this discussion. People don't talk about we should limit the carbon emissions, and this is important because of climate. We should save the climate. I mean, that is no longer the debate. However, once again, Denmark, this is an issue that we're generally convinced is important. We may no longer speak that much about climate, but that doesn't change the fact that this is still the issue for the next generations, also this generation, to solve. Denmark, although it could be easy just to say, well, okay, let's not really push this issue, you actually see the Danish government doing the opposite. When the Danish presidency was launched in Aarhus, a very nice university town, so any students out there go to Aarhus and study, could also go to Copenhagen, says the former Pro-Vice Chancellor. But that was where she opened the presidency and she highlighted climate. And that was also what she did in her speech to the European Parliament. And what is important here is that there is an issue here, a dossier that is important for the EU to agree upon during Danish EU presidency, and that is the EU's common goal for emissions by 2040. So what should our emissions be by 2040? That is important in its own right for our overall climate policy in Europe, but it's even more important because we have the climate negotiations taking place in Brazil, COP30. And I've been minister myself, and it's going to be very difficult to have a negotiation where the European Union will be able to play a role if the European Union does not have a mandate. If the minister, so my colleague now Lars Aagaard is Minister of Climate, if he doesn't have a mandate so we can negotiate with the rest of the world. And if we don't have an agreement, then he's going to arrive empty-handed to Brazil. And if that happens, well, what kind of signal is that? If Europe used to be sort of the region fighting for climate change, arrives without sort of any kind of policy. So I think this is really important, not just for Europe, but also for the global climate negotiations as such.
Maybe lastly, we could talk about the EU budget, the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework. the EU has a 7-year budget cycle, which I find totally insane. Maybe it's insane the way we do it in the US, where we have yearly budget cycles. We can never get an agreement and we just extend it and eventually have a new budget. But there are 7-year budget cycles. So the upcoming the fight has now started over what the next 7-year budget cycle for the EU will look like. That begins in 2027, and it's beginning in the Danish presidency. And so, how do you see this? Is this going to be a major topic that Denmark is going to try to push in a certain direction?
I mean, it's not going to be a huge topic among Danish citizens, although, what could usually get Danes very excited, that is about sort of the question, how much should we pay to the EU? Should Denmark have a rebate from the budget? These topics are obviously very popular. But again, there I see some changes. Pretty certain, if you ask Danes, should we have a higher budget because of Ukraine? Then you could possibly get a yes. But this will be a very, very complicated negotiations. They'll last for 2 years. So what Denmark can do is sort of on the basis of the Commission's proposal to see whether one can structure the negotiations, agree upon sort of the way you should discuss these issues. Should we have the debate about common agricultural policy first and then structural policy afterwards? Should we divide the budget in a new way? So agree upon the overall structure. That is the hope, but without numbers or without figures. So that would already be a very big success. It's difficult because, as you can imagine, money, we're talking about countries, we're talking about interest groups. They're used to getting a donation almost from the European Union every month. So if that's no longer the case, you would obviously immediately have sort of French farmers driving to Brussels and protesting. Also a situation where you could argue that we have so many new topics, and we covered most of them here, defense, migration, and if you have a different Europe, should you still have the same budget? So should you still have a situation where 2/3 of the budget is spent on agriculture and structural funds? Well, probably not. But, tell that to the French, I was almost going to say, or tell that to countries that are very much dependent upon the structural funds. So this will be, as I said, a complicated discussion also because in Europe at the moment, we have so many countries that have problems at home with their own sort of budget and fiscal policy. Just take France. One example, you may have a new French prime minister because the government will fall, since they're in dire straits, to put it very bluntly. You have Germany that the new government just decided to borrow tons of money. Well, this has created a situation where the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz is being heavily criticized. So should he then travel to Brussels and say, well, we need to have more debt? Probably not. From that perspective, I'm glad that the Danish EU presidency will be over on the 1st of January. Then the Cypriots will take over.
This discussion, it's going to go through, I think, a lot of twists and turns. But Lykke Friis, so great to have you here on the Eurofile. Hope you enjoy the rest of the summer in beautiful Copenhagen. Copenhagen is especially beautiful in July. You're not missing much by not being here in hot and humid Washington, D.C. But thanks so much for being on the Eurofile.
Thanks for having me. Great fun.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.